Alright, so in the last video we talked about the reason why we might live in an increasing cost world, and if you remember, the explanation was specialized factors, that perhaps each country has factors that are specialized in either wheat or cloth production, so that as we increase production of one of the goods, the opportunity cost of that good will rise, and that has interesting implications for how much specialization occurs. So what we've got here then, we've got two countries. The USA has an opportunity cost of cloth in autarky of 1 cloth equals 2 wheat, and in the United Kingdom 1 cloth equals 1/3 of a wheat. I've introduced these indifference curves, which I said, you can look at them if you like, or just take it as a given that this is the way that we tell which point on the production possibility frontier the nations will prefer. If you're an econ major, then by all means you probably need to know this, but if you're not an economics major, you can just take that just as a fact if you like. And so having selected this point, you can see that the US has a comparative advantage in wheat production and a disadvantage in cloth, and the opposite is true in the UK. So once trade opens up, we could imagine the US moving in the direction of specialization in wheat. But something interesting happens. Unlike in the constant cost case, you can see that this tangent that tells us the slope of the production possibility frontier at a particular point, if we start drawing new tangents as we move around, you can see that that slope gets flatter. So as we specialize more, so we see the US specializing in wheat, as we specialize in wheat, that leads to an increase in the opportunity cost of wheat. Or you could say it leads to a decline in the opportunity cost of cloth, which is the same thing. You can see the slope is getting flatter and flatter, and the opposite is happening in the UK, that has a comparative advantage in producing cloth, but as they start to specialize more, if you can imagine drawing another tangent, say at this point, you can see that the tangents would be getting steeper and steeper. So the very act of specializing in cloth drives up the opportunity cost of cloth. So we specialize in cloth, and that leads to a rise in the opportunity cost of cloth. So I suppose in a way you could consider it as being a victim of your own success. You have an advantage in cloth if you're the UK, so you specialize in cloth, but in an increasing cost way. Specializing in cloth drives up the opportunity cost of cloth. So the result actually, and the book can do this really well, much better than me, is that the process of specialization continues. I said the book can do it well because these things are kind of hard to draw, but we move around, but we don't end up on the horizontal axis if we're the UK, because specializing in cloth drives up the opportunity cost of cloth, and we stop specializing. We don't continue to move down along the PPF until we've achieved a point of complete specialization. So the result with trade in the increasing cost world is that our trade line, which I thought was going to be blue or interesting color, and it's not particularly, but never mind. Our trade line originates at this point of specialization. So let's call that B prime, the point of specialization with trade. We're going to put B on the other diagram in a minute. That's the point of production with trade. It involves incomplete specialization. So you know you're in an increasing cost world when after trade has opened up, you will still have both industries. So you can see that there's a larger cloth industry. So here's the production of cloth once trade has opened up, and certainly we're making more cloth, but the wheat industry has not completely died out in the United Kingdom. It's just shrunk in size, but we don't specialize completely. So let's do this in the American diagram, and maybe we can end up with a nice red trade line. So the British move towards producing more cloth. The Americans will move to producing more wheat. And this is my trade line, which looks a lot better. In fact, maybe I'll just redraw this one. And the book does a really great job with this. So take a look at the diagram in the book, because sketching these things is pretty hard. But hopefully you get the intuition a little bit when I do this. So we've got B as the point of production with trade, and we haven't specialized completely, as is the case with the constant cost diagram. The slope of these trade lines is supposed to be equal in the two countries. The absolute slope is the world price of cloth, and so the countries are free to move out along the trade line in the same way that they did in the constant cost case. So here we have the Americans. They have a much larger wheat industry than they had before. This was the autarky point. So wheat has expanded, cloth has contracted, but due to increasing costs, the cloth industry hasn't gone away completely. The country is now free to select a point along the trade line. Here's my indifference map, and knowing what you know about indifference curves, let's see if we can get a tangent at some point. They're probably going to select, let's call that the indifference curve that is selected with trade, and the same over here, the point of consumption with trade. Again, as you see with trade, there's a difference between that which one produces and that which one consumes. We could call this C and C1 as the points of consumption with trade. And we can, first of all, we want to notice that IT, the new indifference curve that the country enjoys, is higher. So I and IT and IT prime, let's see, is the highest possible indifference curve. Attainable with trade, and if you've studied the indifference curves, you know that that's a good thing, because it's higher, it's further from the origin. So this is another way of demonstrating that both countries are better off, because they've both achieved higher possible indifference curves. And at the risk of making this diagram kind of messy, let's use a small color. Let's use a yellow, and just very quickly plot in the exports and imports. So we've got the United States producing wheat at B, but consuming wheat at C. So this distance here are the exports of wheat. Let's just have X equal exports. I hope these match, or at least kind of look like they do. All right, and then we've got the United States producing a small amount of cloth, but importing some cloth. So this amount is the imports of cloth. Maybe we'll call it M for imports. So M equals imports of cloth. And I'm hoping this works. Sketching is kind of a bad idea, but anyway, so here we have the United Kingdom. They are producing at point B, and in terms of cloth, they are only consuming at point C, C1. So this would be the exports of cloth leaving the UK, and hopefully those guys, I think that looks pretty good. That sort of matches this one here should match this one here, otherwise my sketching is getting off a bit. And then we've got the exports of wheat coming out of the USA, and let's see, we've got some imports of wheat. Look at me cheating by making that go down there a little bit just to make it smaller. Didn't quite work out. I hope this makes a lot of sense. As always, you can always write to me. Just send me email and we can talk about this. And the picture in the book's beautifully drawn, of course, but hopefully this gives you an idea of, it's that picture on page 55, chapter 4 of the 16th edition of Pugil. So you can see a little bit where that came from. I've got different numbers, but it's really very similar to the constant cost case, except that these rising costs cause incomplete specialization, which means the two industries continue to exist. And the other little wrinkle here is we've added in indifference curves, which is a further way of talking about the way in which trade is beneficial to both nations. And the final part of chapter 4, I'm not going to do a video about. It's the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, and Heckscher-Ohlin is a very important theory. So I guess this can be called Swedish Pride Week if we want to, because there are a couple of Swedish economists, and that's very nicely explained in the book, so I'm not going to do a video about that. But if you have any questions, as always, please send me email. So the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, the purpose of this theory is not a substitute for what we've done before. It simply it explains the reason why some countries have advantages over others, and it relates to something called factor abundance. So look up factor abundance. Essentially, if you're a country with a lot of labor, you will have an advantage in labor intensive goods, and if you're a country with a lot of capital, you will have advantages in capital intensive goods. So it's just a way of explaining the basis, the reason for comparative advantage. We talked about what comparative advantage does in terms of causing countries to trade with each other, but Heckscher-Ohlin tells us why you might have a comparative advantage in something or not. So that concludes the videos for chapter 4. Week 2's been a little bit heavy on the theory. I'm actually going to make an effort to make it slightly less heavy going forward, but we'll see how that goes.